The Bible is arguably the most enigmatic book of all time. Its depth and richness of narrative, songs, poetry, law, prophecy, and eschatology is unrivaled in its class. This text confounded many for centuries. Attributed to the divine inspiration of the Most High Yah, only a select few were privileged to be able to unravel the mysteries that lie beneath. Today, there are tons of academic gatekeepers who have been able to unlock this coded script using a variety of techniques mostly unknown to laymen. However, today this is no longer the case. Thankfully, Divine Prospect has spent 15 years playing the spook who sat by the door to gather intel on how to best approach the text and get the most objective understanding possible. He is making these techniques available to the general public in the upcoming KHM Holistic Research Paradigm for Bible study classes. For the first time, be able to read the text the way it was intended by the author to his immediate audience. Once you've been able to successfully decipher the scripture, you will then learn how to map it to modern times and yield a harvest of actual results. Sign up today by going to www.patreon.com/Divine Prospect and join the $50 tier to reserve your spot. Seats are extremely limited, so take advantage of this opportunity before it's too late. Peace and shalom. So, part one is methodology. All right. Methodology is extremely critical, crucial, and essential. And it is the building blocks on interpretation when it comes to scripture. Now, before you even get to the interpretative side, there's a whole bunch of prerequisites that must be done in order for you to fully understand what the text is conveying. Not primarily to you today, but primarily between the author and the recipient audience of the time, right? Once you interpret that, then you can extract what you need to apply today, and then we can walk it out, doing one-to-one mapping between two domains, the domain of the past, domain of the present. We understand that domain of the past, and then we map it one-to-one to the domain currently. And when you're able to successfully do that, you can then apply it and yield the results that was intended for the recipient audience the way the author instructed them to carry it out, to know, etc. All right, so methodology is crucial. Context. Let's get into it, right? So I'm going to start off right here. How should Genesis 1:1 be interpreted within its immediate context, right? You may say, well, how should it be? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a quick crash course, and then I'm going to pick up on a source that's going to validate it. Now, in John Day's work, he mentions it. John H. Walton touches on it. I hold the more modern scholarly consensus because it incorporates what? The ancient Near East. Even though John Day does juxtapose his position against the ancient Near East, and so does John Day, they still hold fast, and I think they're doing a deductive analysis, if you ask me, in regards to holding fast to that traditional perspective, right? Because of their core values and beliefs. Whereas Michael Heiser, John H. Walton, and others will eschew that perspective and then try to see it from the perspective of the author and his immediate audience during the Iron Age period in which this was written, okay? But let's go into that, right? Let's see what these perspectives are, okay? So there's three of them. The first one, and again, you may find yourself holding to mainly the first and the third one. There's a few more astute people that research that go into the second form, and I'm going to tell you up front, I hold to the second position once we go into it, right? But we're going to delineate and go further into this because, again, when you get to see a person's doctrine based on how they interpret something, then you can follow and say, okay, I see why they hold this position. And then because you know the position, it makes it easier to argue against, right? And you got to find yourself arguing for that same position that you disagree with. That will demonstrate how much you understand an adverse position to yours, okay? All right, so the first one is what's called the absolute beginning. There are three major perspectives on how Genesis 1:1 should be interpreted in light of its immediate context. When I say Genesis 1:1, its immediate context is Genesis chapter 1, verses 1-3, and then you have an extended context on overall context that goes further into detail and explicates those first three verses. But unless you understand those first three verses, you don't know the background of what's going on. And as we get to our low intertextual analysis and high intertextual analysis, we'll be able to feed more data into Genesis. Because we have the psalmist talking about the beginning, we have Job, and Job talking about the beginning, and Yahweh or Yahu or Yahweh talking about the beginning in Job as well. You're going to see a lot of stuff. We have the book of Proverbs, chapter 8, that talks about Chokhmah. That was the first of his works. In the beginning, she was possessed by him. And I say she because it's a feminine noun. Was possessed by him, who, Yah. We're going to get a lot of information as we transverse through the rest of the Tanakh. It's going to be a wild journey. So buckle up. It's going to be a crazy roller coaster. It ain't nothing like you ever seen before in any theme park you've been to. All right? Because this thing is spiritual. All right. So the first one is the absolute beginning, which is called the traditional perspective. The translation simply reads, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The temporal view. Verse 1 is a completed act prior to the 6 days. Verse 2 then describes the early state of that created world, formless and empty. And verse 3, and God said, starts the day-by-day shaping. So what it's saying is when the text says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, that statement means he started the first act. And that what did that first act look like? Verse 2. So when he created the heavens and the heaven and the earth was formless and void, and the wind of Elohim flooded across the abyss. That's literally how it should be translated, right? But we're going to go through some of that as well as we continue to transverse. So that is the first perspective. Why people choose it? Well, fix the Septuagint or LXS and Arche, the normal force of the perfect bara. So bara is he created, not baro or bero, but bara, the cow perfect, he created. So what they're doing is they're taking a literal interpretation, right? Play by play, literal interpretation. And the merism, heavens and the earth, as a totality of things, meaning that the heavens and the earth is encompassing everything that is the creation of the creator. Nothing outside of that. So when it says the heavens and earth, it includes any celestial beings, the sun, moon, stars, the atmosphere, the universe, space. It incorporates time, with the earth incorporating matter and all that is tangible to us and can be empirically discerned by us. So in verse 1 is the first creation act. Verse 2 describes what that substance is. And in verse 3, he begins to shape it out of that first creative act. He created it. This is what it looked like. Verse 1, he created it. Verse 2, this is what it looks like. Verse 3, let's begin to do something with it, right? But in that material substance are the angels, celestial beings. In that material substance is water, is the land, dry land, is the abyss. The text says the abyss, the depths, which we're going to see in the book of Jonah. Sheol is linked with Abuso. Abuso in the Greek means the abyss. We're going to see this word tehom mentioned in the Hebrew, which means the abyss. All that is incorporated in the absolute beginning traditional perspective. A simple translation that's in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth, which is following after that, right? After in the beginning, God created the heavens and earth. Now the earth was formless and empty, and God said, let there be light. Who translate this way? KJV, ESV, NIV, most pre-modern Jewish Christian versions. Now, a lot of y'all know that I use the ESV a lot, and I use it because it has a good rendering, but it is not accurate all the time. There's no perfect translation. This is why you have to at least learn some of the basics of the language, look up words, know ancient Near Eastern context, etc. Because there's no perfect translation. I tell everybody, my primary source are the original languages and the manuscripts these original languages were written on. Looking at this, taking into consideration textual variants, right, styles, etc. And then from there, I look to see how these things are translated by translation committees, right? And see what their understanding is it by looking at the translation notes, the preface, the appendix, etc., right? But this is This is one perspective that a lot of people, I would say the majority of people, they hold this perspective, okay? Hebrew cues, right? Simplified. Bereshit bara Elohim. In this case, there's no infinitive. The bara is not an infinitive construct. The bara here is simply a cow stem perfected verb. He created. The infinitive would be mean to create, or creating, or something along those lines. All right. Bereshit bara Elohim. In the beginning, God created. Treats bara, the perfect, as a completed past act before verses 2 and 3. So people say, yes, that's what happened. In the beginning, he created the heavens and the earth. Everything in the known world, visible and invisible and visible, all consists of that first act that he created everything. And then verse 2 describes what it looked like. Verse 3 is when he began to shape it. Okay. And then verse 3 opens with what we call the way yiktol. A way yiktol is going to be your wav, your patach, your yod with the dagesh, which is way, or way. In this case, way yomer, right? And he said, the form that advances narrative time. So this weyikto can be interpreted in interesting ways, but in the traditional view, it's just simply saying, and he said. Why? Because if there was no wav and just the yod, it would be in the imperfect tense. But when you add the wav with the patach, you're putting it in the perfect tense. It negates the imperfect and put it in the perfect tense. And this is typically used for narratives. This form is not used in modern Hebrew. It is only in classical Hebrew literature, right? Because it's dealing with a narrative. Modern Hebrew is colloquial language, day to day, not narrative language, unless you're writing literature, right? Fictional literature, historical literature, or whatever the case may be, okay? So this is position one that most people hold. But is this really what the text is conveying to us in its immediate context? Again, Genesis 1:1, according to this view, can stand alone by itself. But is that really the case under further scrutiny? Right? And then we're going to go back to the position that I hold, right? And we're going to sum it up. After this, we're going to go to the position I hold, and then we're going to hold here for the next class, all right? So another position was called the headline or summary title position, right? This comes second to that majority view, which is the traditional view of the absolute, right? And its translation is, verse 1 is a title summary of the whole account, the beginning of God's creating the heavens and the earth, with 2 as a background and 3 onward as the narrated sequence. Temporal view. Verse 1 doesn't locate a separate moment in time. It frames the entire narrative. That means you get the summary in the first verse. It's not in the sequence of things. It's just the summary. The text is not pinpointing a separate earlier moment. It is labeling the whole process. Everything you see throughout the entire chapter is incorporated in verse 1. Verse 1 summarizes the entire chapter, whereas the absolute is that verse 1 is the first act. Verse 2 tells you what the context is, and then verse 3 begins the shaping. All right, it's more sequential, whereas the headline or title perspective, everything is summarized in verse 1. That means you don't need to read the rest of Genesis chapter 2 to the last verse, because chapter 1 sums everything up. That's this perspective. And some of you may hold to this perspective. And I would bet, if I was a betting man, that most of y'all and most of the people in Judeo-Christianity, Israelite community, holds to the first or this third view, because I held to this third view at one point in time. And when I did the first class, I used this perspective with y'all, because this is the surface perspective, that most people understand Genesis chapter 1 and 1 in. Well, if this is just what it was, there'd be no need for this course, right? But it's here for a reason. Let's go to the rest of it. So a sample translation, actually, let's read the third point again. The text is not pinpointing a separate earlier moment. It's labeling the entire process, or the whole process, with narrated time moving forward from verse 3 onward. You see that? So verse 2 is not part of the sequence. It just gives you a background. It's what we call a parenthetical just give you some background information. The summary is in verse 1, but verse 3 onward is a sequential narrated time moving forward sequence. The simple translation is the beginning of God's creating the heavens and the earth. The earth was formless and empty, and God said, "Let there be light." Okay? So it's letting you know the beginning of God's creating the heavens and the earth. Who takes this view? Some modern commentators and study Bibles, often as an option or a footnote. All right? Again, they're using verse 1 as a summary of everything from verse 3 onward, with verse 2 as background information or a parenthetical. Okay? Anything in parentheses is just giving you additional information that is not necessary to tell the rest of the narrative, but it's just some insight the author wants to provide you so you have more background, nuanced information to what is going on and transversing throughout the rest of the narration. Okay? Hebrew Q's reads verse 1 as a nominal heading, like a title line, beginning of God's creating. And verse 2 gives the scene setting, and verse 3 carries the narrative time with way yiktol. Way yiktol. So way yiktol is an agreement with the first perspective and its third perspective, because it begins the narration. We call it the consecutive wav. It begins the narration. Okay, so these things are important because most people hold to the first perspective and this third perspective. Now let's get into the perspective that I hold. I evolved over time. I think at one point in time I had the first absolute perspective. Then I transitioned to this perspective, and then now I'm settling on the final one because I got more into the culture. I understood more of the ancient Near Eastern background, and I got more into the language. And when I got into these things, I moved away from the theological dogma and got right into the cultural substance of the matter.